Welcome to the History of Cyprus podcast, the birthplace of Aphrodite, the legendary goddess of love and beauty. Situated at the crossroads of ancient civilizations, Cyprus holds a pivotal place in history as the fulcrum to the Bronze Age, where cultures flourished and left their indelible mark. As we delve into the annals of Cyprus's past, we'll uncover the mysteries of its ancient kingdoms, trace the footsteps of conquerors and settlers, and unravel the stories of remarkable individuals who shaped its destiny. My name is Andreas, and I am the host of the History of Cyprus podcast. Every month, I will be releasing a new episode as it relates to Cypriot history. I interview leading academics in their respective fields, where we cover Cyprus from 10,000 BCE to the 20th century. We'll discuss language, culture, war, economy, religion, political and social history, challenging traditional narratives and problematizing long-held misconceptions. But what's more, every month we also dramatize primary sources as a teaser for the upcoming episode. You can find the History of Cyprus podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow the History of Cyprus on Instagram and support us through Patreon.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the History of Byzantium, episode 273, Rome and Persia, the 700-year rivalry, with Adrian Goldsworthy. Today I interview historian Adrian Goldsworthy about his new book, and before you ask, yes, we talk all about Heraclius and the final war with the Persians. Stay tuned for some brilliant insights into that ever-fascinating topic. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Goldsworthy is an award-winning historian of the classical world. He's written a dozen books on Greco-Roman topics, including biographies of Julius Caesar and Augustus, as well as studies of the Roman army and the empire's rise and fall. So if you like what you hear today, there is a small library of Goldsworthy goodness waiting for you to read. And if you prefer to listen, you can get his latest book on audible.com. Go to audibletrial.com/Byzantium to listen for free. More on that at the end of the interview. His latest book is about the 700-year-long rivalry between Rome and the Parthians and then the Sassanids. 700 years. It just doesn't sound right, does it? He covers everything from Crassus having gold poured down his throat to Trajan's triumphs and Julian's death, all the way down to Heraclius recovering the true cross, and of course everything in between. The book is already out in the UK with the title The Eagle and the Lion, but it will be out in the USA on the 12th of September 2023 under the title Rome and Persia, the 700-year rivalry. Here's the interview. Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy, welcome to the History of Byzantium podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's a great pleasure to talk to you. I've been following your books for a long time, and listeners may already know that you've covered the Roman army and you've covered the careers of Caesar and Augustus in great detail. So it's not hard to imagine why the wars with Persia would interest you. But can you tell us what inspired you to cover the entire 700-year rivalry in one book?
Well, it's a slightly odd story because the publishers actually approached me and said, would you write a book on the last generation or so very much the 7th century AD and that dramatic change? And I sat down to think about that over the course of a weekend and well, really, you can't understand that unless you've looked at the 6th century before it. And then you can't really understand the 6th century unless you've looked at the 5th. And it came to me that really we need to tell the whole story. Parthia and the Sasanian Persia, they are the same empire. They are two different dynasties, and there are some organizational, and obviously it's a long, long period of time. But as far as the Romans are concerned, you're dealing with this great power to the east pretty much all the way through your history from the 1st century BC onwards. And the more I thought about it, I couldn't think there isn't really any study that looks at relations between the two from the start right to the very end. There are lots of marvelous stuff, particular periods, particular things, and we do compartmentalize things so much as historians, and especially within the academic world, even when you're teaching courses for students. It's almost as if there's this cliff edge between the Principate and then late antiquity, and then later Byzantine history. It's sort of sudden, abrupt, as if there's nothing, you're not starting from something, it's a completely clean slate. And actually, it is, everything makes far more sense when you look at this long perspective, and the changes seem that much more dramatic when they do occur. And the violence and the ambition in that last big war is striking because it hasn't been there before. So it grew to the point where I went back to them and said, no, actually, this is the story I want to tell, because nobody's done it, and it's really important, and it brings you on to the Parthians and the Persians and this world we don't know so much. And even if we can't talk about them in the same detail as we can with the Greeks and Romans, nevertheless, there's more we can do. And at the very least, you can ask the questions, even if you can't get good answers for, how does it seem from their point of view? What's their perspective? Why? So it's very much the story of the relationship. And if you take a long perspective, it's surprising how much peace and stability there is between these two, both aggressive expansionist empires. So that with every book I've written, things have surprised me as I've gone along. And this one, I think even more so. It wasn't what I was expecting. And that makes it more exciting to write and hopefully more exciting to read.
That's interesting, and because I want to talk about that later period later on. But what did you find the most unexpected in that period? Because you would have covered Caesar's plans and Augustus's peace with the Parthians in great detail. So between that and Heraclius, what sort of struck you as?
Well, some of the oddest things is when you actually sit down and think about it, and you realize that the only land battle discussed in any detail is Carrhae, and that's in Plutarch and Dio and bits and bobs from elsewhere. Then the next description of equivalent detail of a field battle is Procopius.
Yeah.
And then nothing. You've got little bits and you've got all this information. So we know there's lots of wars. We know there's loads of battles. We've got, for Ammianus, you get detail of sieges, which you've never had before in that level. And then you get some of that with Procopius as well. And, overall, probably Procopius is the most detailed source you've ever get for relations between the two powers. And yet you've got 700 years of history. We know these big events are going on. They mention the things that happen. So we generalize from some very small little incidents and partial descriptions of those, so that it struck me that what we think of as how the Parthians and Romans fight isn't really based on very much. And that if you look at the things each side actually does, the standard conventional wisdom is that it's the Sasanian Persians who develop good, effective siegecraft, and this seems to appear in the 3rd century as if by magic. But in the past, the Parthians have taken cities, so how have they done that? And how much is evolution rather than sudden revolution? And the convenience for late Romanists, the reason for them that the empire has to reform so much that you get the tetrarchy, you get this militarization, you get the very different system, very different political culture of late 3rd and into the 4th centuries, is because the Sasanian Persians appear, along with a load of Germans beyond the Rhine and Danube, that are suddenly more threatening. But actually, the longer perspective, what's the change? There's very little difference. It's just you're a lot weaker because you're busy fighting civil wars, and you're doing things differently. So everything, even many of the assumptions, there's been a big debate in Roman history about what the Roman frontiers are for. Are they primarily defensive to protect the provinces, or is the empire and the emperor still obsessed with imperium sine fine, empire power without limit, constant expansion? And then you look at the 1st century AD, and okay, the Romans and Parthians do fight each other. There's some small-scale stuff under Augustus early on in Tiberius. You've got the war in Armenia under Nero, and then little bits. But otherwise, there's 100 years. Even those wars are incredibly limited. The Armenian War goes on for a decade, but it's very focused geographically. And it's very limited objectives. And it's primarily each side supporting allies in an Armenian civil war. There's no serious attempt. Even when you look at Crassus or Antony, there aren't serious attempts to conquer huge swathes of territory, ever, which throws this whole debate as to the Romans as sort of fundamentally aggressive into a completely different light, because when you look at what they're actually doing rather than what the poets choose to say now and again, it's far more practical. They're very cautious, and lots of opportunities for conflict aren't followed. So you have, the 1st century is remarkably quiet. Even the 2nd century, big wars, Trajan, Lucius Verus, Septimius Severus, if you're generous, that's maybe 10 years out of 100. And the rest of the time they're at peace, possibly nervous peace at times. But it's you sort of have sense a pattern. It's more like 17th, 18th, and 19th, and even early 20th century Europe. The wars between France and Spain at various times, Prussia, Germany, that occur in the same areas again and again and have short-term advantage, but no real. You're never fighting to destroy the other side. Again, I think it's because perhaps the 20th century and the world wars have influenced us into this idea that you fight a war until you utterly defeat the enemy, that human history isn't really like that. The Parthians, the Persians, the Romans can absorb much smaller neighbors sometimes, but anybody bigger, you don't have the capacity, but also the will. You're not trying to do an Alexander the Great and just charge around and change the whole world. So that long-term perspective just puts everything into a very different light. And it's, as I say, I'd looked at so many of these periods in detail and come with the assumptions that, oh yeah, there's major tension all the time. There's always a threat. The Romans would love to go and conquer large parts of Parthia, Persia. The Parthians and Persians themselves genuinely want to get Syria, get back to sort of the old Achaemenid Empire. They might, it might have been a nice pipe dream that they each people had, but they never really make this serious effort to do that. So the rivalry is very cautious. It's sort of self-imposed limits on the wars you fight. So you fight often, but you're not really expecting too much from it. That means all the wars you then start to look at in a very different way.
Yeah. You get the sense that for long periods, both empires were quite happy with the status quo. I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but that is fascinating about the lack of accounts of campaigns. Do you get the sense that's because obviously I want to ask you later about why we don't have Persian accounts, but I suppose for Roman historians, unless you're living on the eastern border or you're posted there like Procopius, you're unlikely to run into soldiers you can ask, oh, what happened?
Well, it's not so much that. I mean, I think there was a lot, and obviously you've got Lucian's satire about all the different accounts written of Lucian's various operations and how ridiculous and over the top they were. But that also implies there were some, that these ones are funny means that there were some more sober versions. But I mean, Britain, obviously, it's northern fringes of the empire, but having written on Hadrian's Wall, where you're dealing with about half a dozen mentions of this structure in all Greco-Roman literature, including Bede. It's and something as big as that, a monument, and they never bother to tell us what they're doing. It's that reminder of just how much we've lost. Yes, there's always the element as well of the things they don't bother to tell you because they just assumed everybody knew. And you can see that if you read Caesar's commentaries. But when you think there's nothing as detailed as that for an account of campaigning for the army of the Principate. Josephus is the closest, and he's dealing with a war of sieges. So it's not quite the same as you see the Roman army doing some things, and it's great that we've got that detail. But we've got all this archaeological evidence. We know there's this huge institution, this very organized, sophisticated army, and we've just got to guess that it works in a similar way to Caesar's men. And then when you think you have so little of Ammianus has survived. Most is lost, and he started in 96. So obviously the earlier centuries weren't described in as much detail, but and you come back to Lucian, he writes this satire mocking ridiculous histories, but scholars are so desperate we try and use it to plot the campaigns because there is nothing. And yet this is a campaign led by one of the two emperors that is much trumpeted at the time, greatly celebrated. And it's that chance of survival that means that there is so much we're guessing, and then the archaeological element where yes, you can plot bases, forts, look at their fortifications, look at their size, but only a small number will have been excavated to any real extent, and even then dating things, you'll say late Flavian or Trajanic or something, but in terms of trying to understand a campaign, that's means very little. It's there, but why it's there, what the people there are doing, why they're there, it's just left to conjecture largely. I mean, we can sort of suggest things, but it's a wide range of possibilities.
Yeah.
So from having spent most of my adult life studying the Roman army, like most people who work on anything, you feel you're knowing less and less as you go on and
Yeah.
discover, because you realize all the bits that are missing.
Yes, absolutely. Well, let's switch from the Romans to the Parthian Sassanids, because I think listeners of this podcast will be pretty familiar with the outline of the rivalry, but like me, I think they will have a real gap in their knowledge of how the Parthian and Sassanid state operated. So could you tell the listeners a little bit about how the government ran and how it was different from Roman rule?
It's different in several ways. I mean, we've obviously got to say the caveat at the start that yes, there are problems and gaps and things we don't know about the Romans, about the Byzantines later on, but by comparison, there's even less that we can say with absolute confidence, because they do not leave. There is no substantial surviving Parthian literary tradition telling the story from their point of view. You get the odd interesting little thing where Josephus has this sort of digression about Babylonian Jews who become bandits, who then become recognized as governors under the Parthian king of kings. But he's telling you it because it's a Jewish community and they do know something about what's going on. But otherwise, with the Sassanians, there is more traces of a tradition. You've got the great inscriptions of Shapur I and some other monuments. You've got a later tradition that survives into medieval literature that preserves memories, though heavily romanticized. And that's interesting how they rather distort the record to play down the 400 years of Parthian rule into about half the time. So that's the start. We've got to be careful. We're guessing with a lot of things. And then you've also got the nature. This is an empire that's heartland is modern day Iran, Iraq, stretching into Afghanistan, parts of Syria, up to the sort of Caspian Sea, Black Sea area, and to the south down to the Gulf. Compared to the Roman Empire, that is very much a world of cities. And that tradition of the city-state, it's the way the Romans, and of course, particularly the Byzantines, because they have the even more, the area that has an even deeper tradition of that sort of organized city civilization, compared to some of the Western provinces where it's largely an introduction of Roman rule. And they have this sense of, you have not far from where I live, you've got Ventus Silorum, the civitas capital of the Silures tribe that's built by the Romans. And by Greco-Roman standards, it's a relatively small city size, but it shows how Roman government could only comfortably interact with a city and a council and those institutions that it understands. So you get the locals to build one. And of course, from their point of view, it makes them more politically significant and influential, but it's imposing something. There are areas like that within the Parthian and Persian empires. And obviously you have cities like Seleucia on the Tigris that in its heyday probably rivals Antioch and Alexandria in size. And you have, because you've had Alexander briefly and then the Seleucids there for so long, you've got this tradition of a Greek city with Greek laws, whatever ethnically the people are, culturally, this is Greek. You have Parthian foundations nearby that are deliberately less Greek in law, but nevertheless, it's still the city idea that's there. And of course, you have the traditional, the Babylonians and people like that. You have cities whose self-identity predates any Greek influence and indeed any Achaemenid Persian influence and goes back, and they are still, the temple cults are going for a very long time. So you've got areas that are quite like the Roman Empire. And there is always this question about the division between the two empires really cuts across the old Seleucid Empire, which in a sense could be seen as a whole, a coherent. And it's slightly surprising that one or the other empire doesn't control all of this instead of always remaining. But then you move into central Iran and areas like that where there isn't this urban tradition. It's very different. So one thing to remember is both the Parthian and the Sasanian Persian kings, the title is King of Kings. This is a kingdom of other kingdoms. So you have quite large regional powers, and obviously at times, depending on influence, these will include Armenia, but more often Media and others where it's more consistently, you could feel part of the Parthian Persian Empire. But within those kingdoms, you have lesser kings as well. And that seems to be the roots of the Sasanian family of Ardashir when he takes over, that he sort of works his way up stage by stage, going sort of local king, regional king, challenging the king of kings. So it is it's a huge empire. It doesn't have the sea in the middle, which is obviously characteristic, particularly of the United Roman Empire, but even, of course, for the Byzantines. While they've still got those provinces, you have this relatively fast communication, at least at certain times of year in certain conditions, that links them, instead of mountain ranges that sometimes have passes that don't necessarily go in the way you want them to go. Areas of steppe, areas of semi-desert, areas that are very well irrigated and well. So it's a mixture, and it takes much longer to get from one end of the Persian Empire to the other, even though it's not physically as big as the Roman Empire, just because of the nature of the landscape and the speed of travel. But so you have the King of Kings. You also, within the kingdoms, particularly in the heartland of more to the east, so away from the Roman Empire, not the more Hellenized areas are closer to Syria and the Roman Empire, but you have the great noble families, the great clans like the Suren, the Miran, the Karen, and these they seem to have been founded by, it's tempting to call them Parthians, but you're never quite sure whether all these people are ethnically Parthians of this group that's moved into the north of the Seleucid Empire and taken over a province and gone from there, or are they locals, leaders who decide to ally with this group and then become part of it? But they speak the Parthian language, which again is not the one the nomads have brought in with them. It's one from the north. They have a form of Zoroastrianism that is particularly Parthian, more than the style that will be dominant but not exclusive with the Sasanians. And these people, the man who defeats Crassus at Carrhae in 53 BC is the Soren, the head of the clan. We don't know his individual name. He's subsequently executed by the King of Kings for being too ambitious, too powerful, too successful. And that's the problem. You have a tradition of the King of Kings has a number of wives, as well as the larger harem, that many of whom are daughters of the noble families, daughters of the petty kings. And it seems to be that if you could get recognition, or if the King of Kings chose to, that the child of any of these could become the favored heir. So there are usually lots of heirs around, which means that although each family, quite impressively, both the Arsacid Parthians and the Sasanian Persians, they managed to exclude everybody who's not of their blood from a claim to be King of Kings. Nevertheless, they have the problem that there's usually lots of siblings around and other lines of the family. And you notice both with the Parthian kings and the Persian kings, they will very often have brothers or half-brothers as kings of the larger regions. And to some extent, that means they're a useful ally, but they're also a potential rival. So it's a balancing act all the time. I mean, the Emperor Tiberius talks about ruling the Roman Empire as holding the wolf by the ears. The problems are different, but the precariousness of the situation is similar for the Parthians and the Persians, because again, a rebellion can happen at one extreme of the empire, and it can take a long time before you've got the strength to deal with it. And your army, to a great extent, relies upon the contingents provided by the kings, the lesser kings, the clan leaders. You know, you have the tradition of the Suren, the Miran, the Karen. They go right the way through, even though they are essentially associated with the Parthians. Most of these families change size to the Sasanians, and then they're there right the way through. And different clans rise and fall, but they keep providing many of the generals, many of the senior ministers right the way through. And we can tell from surviving clay seals from official documents that have survived, they are still using the Parthian language, they're still using the titles, and some of them will actually go on after Sasanian Persia has fallen. They will continue under the Arab Caliphate for generations. So you've got these regional powers that are mostly loyal and mostly will obey, but you can't be sure of them. And you have the problem that there is nearly always at least one, and often several, other potential kings of kings around. And of course, this is the pattern you have, particularly under Augustus, but at later times as well. Princes from Parthia are sent to go and live in Rome. and hostage is probably the wrong word, but the Romans back several men who go back trying to become kings. None of them succeed in the long term, but while there's a tendency to say, well, that's because they've become too westernized and the locals just don't respect them. They also can't understand the politics. They haven't lived it to know the relationships between the families, the balance of power, the gestures you have to do not to upset anybody. Even the one that Tacitus says, he's criticized because he doesn't like hunting anymore and doesn't like feasting in the Parthian style. He's become too Roman. And that's probably true, but we should also remember plenty of homegrown noblemen and princes fail dismally when they try to become king of kings, do not last very long. It's rather like Roman civil wars. You get strong rulers who keep stability for a long time. Then there are periods where somebody gets murdered, there's weakness, and often you have a very rapid turnover and a period of a decade or so of civil war before another strong man appears who manages to frighten, placate, and convince enough people that it's better to keep him around than rebel. So it's similar. There's a lot of similarities with the Roman Empire, but there are also profound differences in the way it works. Although there are some things we don't understand. You have the rise with the Persians, clearly from the frontier defenses that have been excavated and studied now near the Caspian Sea. There must be large numbers of pretty much professional troops to garrison these, but we don't quite know where these come from, when they develop. Again, it's so difficult to understand the processes. Something will suddenly appear when the Romans notice it, and it'll be talked about, or it'll appear in a relief or something like that. But we don't know much. So you've got similar but different, and overall, although it's the Parthian Persian Empire, it's not as big as the Roman Empire. It's nowhere near as well populated as the Roman Empire because of the nature of the land. And because of that, it's not as wealthy, but it's still far, far bigger than anyone else that's out there with whom the Romans have contact. And both Parthians and Sasanians have some contact with China, but even that's pretty distant to the point where it's never conflict or serious rivalry. It's distant trade and some, political diplomatic contact.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Do shoot this down if it's completely inaccurate, but just because I'm just thinking about the Romans, certainly in certain periods, have a much more meritocratic process by which men rise up through the bureaucracy and the army, and obviously are very sort of legal based, and you are a general, it has nothing to do with where you come from. Iranian culture in those empires sounds a bit more like Western Europe as it would develop in the Middle Ages, as sort of a sense of family, and your house is important and your nobility is something you want to promote. And so if there had been a Western Europe, if Charlemagne had created a Sasanian empire, he would have had to manage sort of noble houses from France and Germany in that way.
Yes, I mean, there's a similarity. In older books, there was a great tendency to describe the Parthians in particular as feudal, and their military system as essentially that. And I mean, the medievalists now get worked up about the word feudal and whether or not you should use it. So it's all, but there is that pattern of relationships that, again, we sometimes forget, though, that within the Roman Empire, at some periods, there is a great reliance on allied kingdoms and these dynasts that you appoint. And that's the pattern, particularly the first century BC and into much of the first century AD. And one of the issues is, just who's approving the king of Armenia. But people like Cleopatra, their whole career is being a loyal Roman ally, but they get painted because they end up on the wrong side in civil wars. They get painted as an enemy, but they never actually fight the Romans. Their staying in power for them relies on providing whoever is the dominant Roman at the time with the money and resources that they want, and not really caring too much about your own kingdom. It's simply survival, because if you don't do it, they'll find somebody else who will. Again, and many of the regimes that develop and some of the kingdoms in these areas don't seem to have particularly deep roots, particularly in that sort of, Osroene areas like that, even parts of Medea, let alone Commagene, Cappadocia, these sorts of areas. The Romans chop and change dynasts, and you'll get, the Herod family spread around over quite a wide area as they're chosen for various, you can have this bit. And in the end, most of them don't last, but nevertheless. So there's an element of that even within the Roman system, but it is much more pronounced because it's a different tradition there. And also, there do seem to be these very strong regional identities. Now, you could argue that with the Sasanians, there's more promotion. There seems to be a development of more of a bureaucracy. But again, most of the evidence for this comes quite late. It's 5th century, 6th century onwards. And there is a tendency for some scholars to assume, well, along comes Ardashir I, snaps his fingers, and suddenly you have the Sasanian Persian Empire, that it doesn't develop. And also you have, the famous inscriptions by the priest of Zoroaster, who sort of has almost a parallel inscription to Shapur's triumphs of all the things he did and where he made new fire temples in Roman territory and all this sort of thing. Now, we don't quite know how much that reflects the power he really had, because you get the other traditions whereby they're quite indulgent of, the Prophet Mani and people like this at the same time. There is perhaps slightly more attempt at centralization and central control, and an almost, the genius of the Romans, or call it what you will, was whereas America is the great melting pot, Rome didn't bring people to it. It went out to the world and made them Romans, at least the elite and substantial numbers beneath that as well. To the extent where when the Western Empire collapses, nobody's saying, I want to be British, I want to be Spanish. They all want to be Roman. And, within the Eastern Empire for that long time, it's hard for people to imagine an alternative. Civilization has become tied up with being Roman. And that's just reinforced as the church develops as well. There is, so the Romans do that, but the Romans are very unusual in incorporating people and making them Roman. And obviously, later on, some of the generals that rise who, will be described as a Sarmatian, an Alan, a Frank or whatever. But to all intents and purposes, yes, they might have fair hair, but they're Roman. They do everything just as any Roman would. And even, you've had that early on, back to Romulus and Remus, it's the story your population comes from outside. You've had this, and you've enfranchised your slaves, and particularly their children, from very early on and made them Roman. So there isn't, the identity is much more, it's not ethnically based in any way. It's much more, so it's harder to do that within the diversity of the Parthian and Persian Empire. And you notice as well that they have, the kings of kings tend to move around and they spend time in different capitals, but also just possessing here. And partly that's a climate thing. There are parts of the empire where it's too hot to be in summer, it's too cold in winter, but it's also, as emperors like Augustus will do, as some of the later Western emperors and Eastern one will do, it's the moving around to be available, to make your presence felt, to receive petitions. But again, it's easier to do in the Roman Empire than it is in the East. And it's hard to know whether the development of a more centralized bureaucracy under the later Sasanian kings of kings is simply a development because the regime has been there. And whether, when you get traces of this in the sources, is this just a strong man who is able to impose his will far more effectively in the same way that, say, a Diocletian can, or a Constantine, or a Justinian even, but other weaker emperors or other weaker kings of kings can't. So depending on, often we're looking at a time, most of the best sources for the Parthians come at times of their civil wars. So you shouldn't expect a king of kings to be that powerful and that influential. So it's again, it's always the problem. We're looking from the outside. We're looking with all the misunderstandings the Romans bring. And then we have a little bit of information from inside. But I think from a practical point of view, the empire clearly works because it survives for such a long time and it's successful and it's powerful. So I think this almost devolution of power seems to work within that system.
Yeah. And do we have a sense why they didn't develop a tradition of writing histories? I mean, not that most states did, but or do we know of histories or any kind of sense that things were lost?
Again, a lot has been lost. It probably was never. I mean, you've got cities like Seleucia, you've got the Hellenistic tradition. So there is that tradition that is unusual when the Greeks developed this idea of let's write narrative history, and then the Romans take that on. But I mean, the Romans don't really start that till end of the 3rd century, early 2nd century BC, after the war with Hannibal. But it's quite clear they've kept records before that. And a lot of ancient states will keep their records, their laws, their property, rituals, this sort of thing. The Babylonians are like recording astronomical observations and how this relates to the calendar, to religion, to their beliefs. So people are recording things. And you have several Greco-Roman authors claim that when they tell you a story, so some of the things about the origins of the name Sasan, the house of Sasan, that they have consulted Persian records. And others refer to Parthian records. So, and that they're official, this is what they say about themselves. You suspect that in a lot of these areas, the culture remains primarily oral. And some of the later medieval tradition and figures like Rustam and things like that, they're clearly from that sort of epic poetry, that heroic poetry, the same tradition that occasionally you'll get the Homer who writes it all down, or that gets written down eventually, that crystallizes, but that if it's left as a living thing, it evolves, it develops, it adapts to, but it preserves elements of earlier things. So, some people have argued that you can associate the character of Rustam with the Suren, and perhaps even the Surena that defeats Crassus, but lots of other people as well get rolled into the hero. I think it's largely that. And then we have the frustrating thing is we have these collections of clay seals from that reflect the Sasanian bureaucracy. So they're addressed to a man, his title, general of this area. But obviously those once were around scrolls and documents that didn't survive the fire. The clay gets baked, so we get the seal, but all the rest of it's gone. So there was a huge amount of written material, even if it was often bureaucratic or letters, instructions, orders, this sort of thing. Again, it was there, probably not quite to the same extent as the amount there was in the Greco-Roman world, but a lot still. But it's gone. It's that problem we have to face with so much of human history, but particularly the ancient world, anywhere really, other than till comparatively recently. Because, of course, you've got those few Chinese records of contact with the Parthians and the Sasanians. But even that's probably only a small part of what was officially there. And this is dealings with a very distant fringe people. And it's interesting how as you'd expect with any culture, just as the Romans and Greeks misunderstand what they see, the emphasis in the Chinese sources on the Parthians as rice growers, because that's what you'd expect. What else would you're acknowledging these people are fairly civilized, they're organized. So what else would you do? And we've obviously always got to be on the lookout for where the Romans are doing exactly the same thing and just assuming, well, they're basically like us, or just misunderstanding things.
Brilliant. I definitely encourage people to buy the book, obviously, but to follow you as you connect those threads from those first encounters in the late Republican era all the way up to Heraclius, which is where I want to turn now for the last part of the interview. It's obviously a very dramatic and popular story within the history of Byzantium. Listeners will remember Maurice restoring Khusro II to his throne and then being overthrown by Phocas. And Khusro II then, to avenge his patron, starts conquering the eastern border. And what do you make of that? Because that's kind of what you talk about across the whole book, is that both sides are pretty happy with this border. A lot of the wars are fought for sort of PR purposes. What do you think? I mean, we are speculating, but what do you think makes Khusro II think, no, I'm going to attempt something bigger?
I mean, you can't exclude the personal element. He might genuinely have felt that, having been saved by someone who's now murdered, that he owes it to that memory to do the same in reverse, basically. And of course, you have possibly, he claims he's got Maurice's son there early on. Now, whether it really is or not, because it depends on how literally you take the Roman sources of them all being murdered, who then disappears, and we don't know what happens to him. So are you actually just trying to repay the compliment, do exactly the same thing? I think there's a lot to be said for the idea that probably his ambitions change and develop. Because again, we have a severe problem. If we had a Procopius for these years, and you could follow year by year in detail those campaigns, because it takes them years to break through the Roman frontier. And this has become over a century and more back, really going back into the 4th century. In the world, you start to see an Ammianus of border fortresses, well defended. The emphasis on campaigns is not battles, but sieges. Because if you could take and either sack or even hold on to these fortresses, you're able to sort of move your advantage forward a bit. And that frontier has crystallized, got stronger on each side. But because we have such flimsy, the sources are so poor, you forget that the Sasanians spend years battering their way through. And presumably some of these sieges are the same sort of epics that you have in Ammianus and Procopius, where you've got all the attempts to intimidate the defenders, then negotiate, persuade them to give in. In the past, in the main, the Persian King of Kings on these campaigns has been looking for money. Yes, he wants glory, but it's come in and it's to extort from the individual cities and then get a good deal from the Roman emperor to go away, essentially to leave them in peace. And you wait until the Romans are busy in the West or weak otherwise. So there's an element of the pattern that you could say at the start, maybe that's just it. He knows the Romans are weak, so let's go and see what I can achieve. But normally, the Romans respond far faster to get a field army or two into the area to start to make life hard for the Persians. So you notice this very much a pattern of diminishing returns in Procopius in particular. The accounts of the first year or so of expedition, they raise loads of money, they extort lots from the cities, they take several. Second year, they don't get so much, and so on. And it tends to the point where you actually feel the King of Kings should have made peace earlier when he could have got a better deal, and he ends up with a worse one. But the temptation was just roll the dice one more, play another hand, raise the stakes. But this doesn't happen because the Roman troops that are sent to the area are partly divided over their loyalty, but focuses generals on the spot don't do well. And you almost feel the Persians, maybe there's just a sense of an opportunity. Okay, we've got another year. We can go and besiege these. Nobody's going to stop us. So let's get a bigger advantage. And then it reaches the point where they have effectively taken out the Roman frontier system. And they can move freely much deeper, and there's still nobody to stop them. So does it develop from, let's just see, let's put some pressure on, and I can use the perfect, they usually need a pretext for war. Neither side wants to just declare war on the other. So they claim some faults on the other's part. And one of the frequent ones has been, well, you Romans need to help pay for the frontier defenses to the north that are stopping the White Huns and others from coming, and they'll bother us, but they'll also bother you. So, we're doing you a favor, pay us some money. And in the past, you've agreed to this. You've got the vengeance for your dead patron. And but what's odd is that relatively early on, one of the striking themes, again, and it's there in detail in Procopius, but you can go right back to Augustus's day, and certainly it's there in detail in Tacitus' account of the war with Nero, is all the embassies that are going back and forth. Whenever there is, even when there's open war, let alone between them, each side's talking to the other all the time. And sometimes it's on the pretext of let's ransom some prisoners or something like this, but they keep on making each other an offer, okay, let's make peace, we'll give you this, that's okay. And the wars go on when neither side's quite satisfied with the negotiation. Once Khusro or Khusro's representatives refuse to speak to the Romans, or Roman ambassadors are brought to him and he has them arrested, then executed, that's profoundly different. That suggests that at least at that point, if not before, he's decided, I can get more than this. I can actually take territory permanently. Because if you think back to all the wars they fought for centuries, how much land has any King of Kings ever taken permanently? It's tiny. It's, you might take a city, and yes, you've abandoned Nisibis, the big, great, and how that dominates the sources is who's to blame and what's gone wrong, and this is a great disaster. But it doesn't actually change the size of the territory you control very much. It just gives you a slightly more advantageous frontier and a slightly less advantageous frontier for the Romans. So suddenly, to stop talking, and you're starting to occupy land and cities with a view to saying, and this is more marked, obviously, they go into Syria and Palestine. And when you start to take the big cities, the Antiochs, the Jerusalems, places like this, and then later on in Egypt. And it is largely because there's no one to stop him. The Roman attempts to block them are pretty feeble because the civil war dominates what's going on and then leaves them so weak. And yes, maybe there's a longer term overstretch from Justinian's expansion and the fact that you've still got people like Heraclius out there in Africa with some troops, enough to mount a successful bid to the throne, but you've got to leave some there, otherwise that area is overrun as well. So there might be some of that, but I think we're always tendency as historians, we want to see underlying causes, changes in factors. There might even be in all of this an element of luck, that the Persians just do very well and they win more than they have for ages. And then it starts to snowball. And then Khusro thinks, well, actually, because there's clearly, even though there's been this self-imposed restraint in wars between the empires before then, they don't like each other. And there is this sort of dream of let's conquer the world. Let's be the king of all the Aryans and the non-Aryans, literally, rather than just in, the same as Augustus can talk about ruling in India and this sort of thing. I think it develops, and then chance plays a part. And it's striking to me that the attitude of many of the Roman communities within these provinces is quite similar to a lot of Western communities in the 5th century, in that central government the empire can't protect you. So you're faced with a choice. Do you deal with, in the West, it's a barbarian warlord. Here it's a far more organized, but not necessarily huge numerically army. But if they treat you fairly well, if they'll grant you reasonable terms, then you can't be expected to die for an emperor who's not supporting you. And maybe the empire will come back. So cities start, and that's the pattern that obviously when the Arab armies come in again, it's the same thing. But it's because Heraclius will win and the Persians will get chased out, we sort of see this as more of an aberration, but it's actually quite similar to things other Roman communities, the way they've reacted to the same sort of threat, because you don't have the military capacity to rebel and do it. The empire has very much deterred any development of that sort of tradition. You haven't wanted that. So you're left, when the army isn't there, there's not much you can do. And when the Persians are willing to deal with the local nobility, and essentially communities keep their laws, they keep their traditions, most importantly, they keep their religious practices. You're not going around knocking down churches and putting up fire temples. You're actually treating people pretty well enough that, yes, you're imposing tribute on them, you want lots of money, and you are an invader, but they can it's not so terrible that they can't accept it, at least in the meantime, and hope maybe things will get better.
Yes, I think growing up on stories of the French resistance or whatever has misled a lot of people about what communities in medieval and ancient times were realistically able to do. So final question. What's your assessment of Heraclius's career? Because people are always tempted to say, well, Heraclius is a strategic genius because he wins the war. But there are those who push back and say, well, he started a civil war that led to this. He lost early battles and then he lost to the Arabs. So how do you see him in a wide view?
It's never simple, and you've always got to be careful to, it's fine as an after dinner conversation, but you never want to get into your top 10 list of generals and who could win, and which, okay, you've even got in the ancient world with Scipio and Hannibal talking about who's the best sort of thing. But the problem is Focus is clearly not doing a good job. He's risen in it, but think how many emperors have come to power that way. Not so much recently in that case. This is almost a throwback to the 3rd and 4th centuries of how you do things. But he's not defending well against the Persians. So I don't think, again, you could argue, well, maybe he should have been a good, loyal Roman chap and hope it all worked out. He does win. He clearly has military talent and he clearly can inspire. He starts in a bad place. And again, you have the renewed attempts to let's negotiate. Let's do what we've always done in the past. Let's talk to the Persians. I'm sure the King of Kings will be reasonable. And even that point where you have the letter from the Senate of Constantinople, which is quite extraordinary in the context and not mentioning him. And, you are wondering, would he actually have been willing to step down because they're so desperate? But I think, it's very interesting because, again, he fights, but he does clearly learn. And his expeditions are impressive But the way it all happens, the speed he maneuvers makes it very clear that these are quite small armies. But he's very good at leading, and you've got enough to make a good army that size. And it probably is within the range of the Strategicon and things like that, where, anything over 10,000 is big, anything over 15 to 20,000 is almost unimaginably huge, which is a contrast even to Procopius and Belisarius and others' armies when they're facing the Persians. Not in the West. In the West, the armies are pretty tiny. So I think he's able to, and luck is on his side. I mean, the Persians clearly exhaust themselves, and you have internal rebellion that brings them down. Because probably, I mean, again, you look at all the success the Sasanians have had, but to hold on to all this new territory is requiring numbers of troops they just don't really possess. And it's the problem for any conqueror when there's a rival out there, even if it's someone like Hannibal in Italy in the 3rd century. You take allies away from the enemy, you take over territory, you've then got to protect them. Otherwise, they're back very quickly to the other side. So I think you sometimes have to dial down the rhetoric a bit and realize how desperate these campaigns are. They're extraordinarily bold to, in that situation, think rather than, well, let's hunker down, do the best we can, hold them off as long as possible, actually to say, no, we haven't got that, we'll lose that way, we've got to try and attack, which is a very old-fashioned Roman way of doing things, but it hasn't been anything like as possible in most circumstances. So, I think, yes, the man is talented. Obviously, later, it's hard to believe there isn't a factor of exhaustion after the war for both Sasanians and Romans, because this has been a life or death struggle in a way that nothing has been up until then. It's bound to have been chaotic. You're trying to reabsorb provinces that have been occupied for years on end. And again, think back to the French resistance. The Persians have been in Egypt, in Syria, for as long as the Germans were in France. And, it did take time to put everything back together. And that's when, as with the Sasanians, to a great extent, they've used local institutions, they've used the police, they've used the authorities, the law, all this sort of thing. Even so, it's still a major dislocation in the system. And then you've got the whole competitiveness for who's going to be the factions in charge afterwards. So I think one thing that struck me is that, you have these appeals that Heraclius makes to his men fighting the Persians that promises them you'll get to heaven if you die fighting. You'll be a martyr, effectively. That with buying into that tradition, it's odd that they don't then say that when they're fighting the Muslim Arabs. And I really think they don't take them very seriously, because the tradition has always been, you look back to the Strategicon and the like, Arabs are not a big threat. And that perception of these are people, yeah, they're nasty, they'll raid, but they'll go away. And the Persians are an enemy you've known for so many centuries, and they're big, they're sophisticated, they're formidable militarily, very determined, very smart. So you respect them. Whereas these more ragged-looking armies that appear from states names you've never heard of, you don't acknowledge, and you just think, well, it's a storm, but it's a storm that'll pass. But of course, you have, for many of these communities, they're being occupied for the second time, and the Arabs also treat them very well. There is great respect, and partly that's a religious aspect. It's easier for them to do within the Roman Empire than it is to some extent with the Zoroastrian Persians. There's more hostility there, whereas you go to Jerusalem and yes, you march in, but you don't start pulling down churches and you build a mosque off to the side. So so I think for communities that in their own memory can think of an occupation before, it's much easier to give in a second time round. And you also, you acknowledge you can't fight. But again, it's always, dangerous just to say, well, this is why one side loses. One of the reasons the Arab armies win is that they're good at what they're doing. And they get on a roll, they get the confidence, they gather momentum, and their ability to incorporate others in the evidence you have for Jews, for Christians, for others fighting in the early armies and getting their share of the loot, in the survival of the Suren and the Karen and these great clans for generations, means that we tend to work back from the Reconquista, the Crusades, the Islamic conquest, and see everything in this later opposition, where it's much more bitter, at least sometimes. I mean, that's a more complex story than the sort of the casual look suggests. So I think he's a very able man, but you have to be the first to say that he is emperor in a very difficult time period. And he is not like many of these talented people. They're not perfect. They make mistakes as well. And so many commanders, Alexander the Great had the, in a sense, good fortune to die before he lost a battle. Someone like Napoleon, if they'd been shot in 1812, might have had a different reputation. You've almost got to live long enough to get old to fail. And Heraclius, to an extent, does that. He goes on, he's not the vigorous man he's been. He can't command armies in the field because obviously, yes, as a commander, he gets good treatment. He's got slave servant staff around him. But when you still think about the distances he traveled in those campaigns, in some very rugged, very difficult terrain, and he's campaigning throughout the year. I mean, he goes into winter quarters for a short period. You've got to be tough as old boots to do this stuff, as have your soldiers, and you're setting an example to inspire them. So this is someone who's done a lot, but a decade and 2 decades on, you can't keep doing that. That's something that. So I on the whole, I'm still. Fan's probably the wrong word, but I'm still inclined to think this is a very able man who does a lot and achieves a lot, and he's also lucky. As this deep Roman tradition, the best commanders are lucky because if you're not, you've had it anyway. So it's not all his ability. There are other people involved. There's chance, and there's this overreach on the part of Khusro that turns his own generals against him, and perhaps this tradition of starting to get suspicious of his own people, which would not be unusual within this system. And you can always say, well, given that they did rebel, then he was right to be suspicious. But it's always chicken and egg situation with that sort of thing.
It's such an interesting answer, and I think this is where we'll close the interview, because you've just made me realize that had Heraclius died in his sleep before the Arabs invaded, we would now be saying, oh, if Heraclius was still alive.
Exactly. It would have been different. He could have held them back. Exactly. That's the thing. I mean, it brings us back to, yes, we look at the trends, we look at all the military culture, the economy, the society behind it, but these are still flesh and blood human beings, and they all have their personalities. And whilst, yes, it's not all about one man, it's not all about the commander, nevertheless, these leaders do make a huge difference. And those little chances of the stray arrow that takes somebody out when they're young, or that misses them and adds to their heroic image. And given those campaigns, he could have got killed, and he could have died of disease, and he could have just died in his sleep. And as you say, it would have been, that was the decisive factor that caused it all. So
well, it's insights like that I hope people will be inspired to go and buy the book and to read more and to learn more about the rivalry. Dr. Goldsworthy, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's been great fun.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I certainly did. As I mentioned before, if you'd like to listen to the book for free, then go to audibletrial.com/Byzantium, where you can sign up for a free trial of Audible's service. And you get to keep that for 30 days, and you can keep the book forever for free. If you don't want to stick with Audible's service, but why wouldn't you? I am still a subscriber to Audible years later. It's like having a second podcast app full of amazing audio. And it's addictive once you start going through their catalogue and finding all the good stuff there. Because it's not just books. You can find old sitcoms and TV episodes if you're into that the way I am. Anyway, that's it for the history of Byzantium today. But if you'd like to know more about the history of Cyprus, that underrated and undercovered part of the Byzantine Empire, then check out the History of Cyprus podcast. Andreas is not going in chronological order, so if you're interested in the Byzantine period, there are already episodes touching on the condominium with the Caliphate and the Crusader occupation of the island. But there's also episodes about British rule and other modern stuff, as well as stuff before the Romans even appeared. So check out the History of Cyprus wherever you get your podcasts.